Hello, my friends. This is episode 29. I can't believe it. I can't believe I've got this many. I still have a few more to go after this. This is a series I've been doing, telling my stories about dealing with my mental health, dealing with the struggles of drug addiction, my terrible choices, living with the consequences of those terrible choices. But ultimately, but God, I love that saying, but God stepped in and eventually gave me the wisdom to handle my mental health correctly. He stepped in and freed me from my drug addiction. He stepped in and really overruled a lot of my terrible choices because, frankly, I should not be here. Oh my goodness, there's no way I should still be alive. But yet, here I am telling these stories. So I praise God. That's the reason why I'm doing them. Disillusionment, despondency, discouragement, and defeat. All these D words, they only tell half of the emotions I was feeling as I stood on my parents' deck. As I told in the last story, I just got off a phone call where my entire world was blown up again. In that same story, I had made a joke that perhaps fourth time's the charm for me because I failed at college, military, and Denver. I understood those previous three because I was living a life of sin that got progressively worse with each failure. But what I did not understand is why I was enduring this fourth major failure in my adult life. I mean, I'd completely given myself over to allowing God to have his way in my life. I'd given myself over to his intense, refining fire. I was so hyper-focused on doing everything right to the point I worked hard to not even go 1 mile over the speed limit. For those who know me, they know it's a pretty big deal because I love to go zoom zoom. Sorry for being a dork, but that's it. I love to drive really fast. I was also committed at church. I was telling everybody that who would listen to me about Jesus. I quit every conceivable addiction cold turkey, including cigarettes. I've never told this detail before, but I was easily going through 2 packs a day, sometimes 3, because back then they were only $1 a pack, so it was really cheap. And that was for the premium brands. That was for Camel Lights. That was for, Winston's, all of those. I can't imagine paying the $5, $6 a pack, $10 a pack cigarettes today. But, oh man. So anyway, I also gave up all my music, which was another huge deal that I've never touched on in any of my stories. I was obsessed with rock music. I could barely function without something blaring in my ears. There's not something blaring in my ears right now. Music was everything for me. In my mental health, in my whatever, I don't know what other excuse to give, but I honestly believe that if I had the right song playing at the right moment, then my life would suddenly make sense, at least for that day. I worshiped music big time because I was incredibly proud of my eclectic and diverse collection of CDs. I've been to many unbelievable concerts. I've survived many a mosh pit in those hard rock concerts I was going to. If my whining theme isn't clear, I was very full of myself. You notice how many times in my last thing I just went through, I said, I did such and such. I had a real problem with pride, and full disclosure, I still do. God is forever allowing situations to come into my life to this day where I need to humble myself under his mighty hand. That's the first half of 1 Peter 5:6. But check this out. The second half of that verse is, so that he may exalt you at the proper time. So the full verse is, humble yourself under God's mighty hand so that he may exalt you at the proper time. 1 Peter 5:6. You see, I wasn't ready to be exalted yet. Truth be told, the second half of that verse, it rarely happens in my life because of all my sins, pride is the most potent and consistent. I still am, but it took me a long time to come to grips with just how grotesque my pride is. then, especially back then, I pretended like I was giving God all the glory for the successes he was allowing when I came home from Denver. But really, I was secretly buying into my own hype. I was my biggest hype man. Even telling you this now, it causes me to cringe a little bit because I can feel that ugly pride rising up inside me right now. So back to that moment, back to the beginning of this story when I got off the phone. That moment when I heard that the college that I was supposed to be heading to, who suddenly decided to rescind their acceptance offer in the 11th hour, it ignited this burning, raging inferno deep inside. But looking back, I see what the biggest problem was, is it was my pride. Pride, because now I had to go and tell everybody, nope, I guess I'm staying here. Pride that I worked so hard, so why wasn't God rewarding me? I truly believed, I cannot believe I'm going to admit this, but it was true. I believed that God owed me, that how dare he keep allowing all these failures to happen? Doesn't he know how awesome I am? Oh, man, disgusting. The amount of times I should have been struck by lightning from my blasphemy and insolence. It could power a small city if God actually worked that way, but he doesn't. Nevertheless, God is immensely patient and merciful. Thankfully, he remembers that I am just dust. So, after I told my parents about the latest disappointment and failure, they settled me down and redirected my focus. They reminded me that God never allows his children to experience more than they can handle. They also reminded me that I needed to trust and believe that God loves me more than I could ever imagine, and that I needed to allow Philippians 1:6 to work its power over my heart and mind. That verse is, being confident of this very thing, that he, as in God, which has begun a good work in you, will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. You see, my friends, God had begun this work of fixing my destroyed life, but he still had way more to do, and frankly, he will continue doing it until the day I die, because I will never be perfect on this side of heaven. It was good that they reminded me of this truth and redirected my focus, because the next wave of this new storm, it was about to crush me. And after that, there were more and more. And spoiler alert, I did not handle any one of those storms correctly. I was terrible. There's another detail that I did not tell earlier in my stories. That was that when I first came home, I tried to continue dating April, long distance, of course, for the first couple of weeks. We talked on the phone every day. She was telling me how that she was really struggling with my leaving, but I continually encouraged her to go to church, to pray, to seek Jesus, to let him take over, to let her take over her life, and to do it as I was trying to do. And eventually, through some very important, necessary, loving counsel, I stopped talking to her because it was definitely messing with me in my rehab. Every time I talked to her, I was like, oh man, I can't do this anymore. So thankfully, I listened to that counsel and said, no, I can't talk anymore, April. Well, shortly after I found out that I was not moving to the Midwest, which would be about the 8-month mark, April suddenly called me out of the blue. So 7.5 months or so, radio silence. I had not heard from her at all. Now she suddenly calls my parents and tells them that they need to have me call her back immediately because I had 2 felony warrants out for my arrest back in Denver. No surprise, I completely flipped out. My parents told me I didn't know what to do, so I talked to my pastor about it. He really didn't know what to do, but he suggested I talk to a lawyer. One of my best friends, one of those friends that I talked about in the last one, the friends I grew up with, that stuck through by my side this whole time, he was a lawyer at this point, still is. So I talked to him about it, and I'm admitting right now I don't remember specifically if it was my pastor or my lawyer buddy who reached out to the Denver DA. It doesn't matter. Whoever it was that talked to him found out that what was happening was Denver was in the middle of a major crackdown on the massive amounts of drugs coming and going from that city. So they're going through all their recent drug busts that were still within the statute of limitations. I was never formally arrested for that drug bust I told you about a few stories back, but nevertheless, they still issued a decree that I needed to at least appear in court because they wanted to grill me for some questions. They wanted me to snitch, that's for sure. Well, I never knew about it because I was in New York. And since I did not show up, I received a felony warrant for failing to appear in court. And then I got another felony warrant for the original drug offense, even though I was never charged. The cops were questioning April as to where I was. She told them, I don't know where he is, man. He's in New York. I don't know what to tell you. Apparently they didn't believe her because she'd see them occasionally staking out her parents' house, hoping I would eventually show up at some time. At some point, my buddy did reach out to this Denver DA, and he gave him a glowing character reference. And also my pastor, the deacons at my church, they also mailed, these character references to the DA. Everybody felt confident that it was expunged, even though I had no paperwork. So I'm like, all right, that crisis is over. And I returned to trying to rebuild my collapsed world around me now that I was staying in New York. However, later down the road, this felony incident, it would pop back up and wreck me some more. But, oh yes, we will get there. We will get there. So now, even at this point that I'm telling him back in New York, I was starting to see why God did not allow me to move and pursue that degree in counseling. And 20 years later, I can still see his wisdom, even more clearly, really. And I am sincerely thankful that he put a stop to it. I try to remind myself of all these things that he's prevented in my life. And I try not to get too hung up on this. I try to get to the point where I arrive at the moment of humbling myself and trusting his will quicker these days. I definitely do a lot better than I did when I was younger. More successes and failures, we'll say, at that point. So, anyway, back to my telling New York. Since I was not going anywhere and maybe I would never escape New York, I decided I better settle in. The next couple of years, they were very instrumental in whipping me into shape. I didn't want to go back to Ruby Tuesday, but I had to get a job. So I got a job working at this popular apple orchard that was in the same town where my parents lived. This orchard, it was owned by a Christian family, 2 generations at this point. I'm assuming 3 by now. I mean, that was 20 years ago. They were more than happy to be a part of God's chastening and rebuilding of my life. I told them my testimony, my story, and they were like, yep, we'll put you to work. Sorry, I'm going to get off track again, but this is another important quick detail. When I was a kid, 12, 13, 14, somewhere at that time frame, I used to fall asleep listening to my 2 favorite preachers on the radio, Chuck Swindoll and John MacArthur. Before I threw my life in the toilet, I continued listening to them on a regular basis. So because these owners of the apple orchard, they were okay with me listening to stuff, having headphones in my ears while I worked. So I did. I spent the entire shift listening to the local Christian radio station. I was submerged in hours of preaching. I mean, MacArthur and Swindoll and Dobson and David Jeremiah and Alistair Begg and Chip Ingram and all these fabulous pastors I was listening to hour after hour, my entire shift. It was just beyond impactful. I can't describe how impactful all this teaching was going on in my life. I worked at that orchard for about 5 months, and during that time, my attitude and heart were drastically changed. The out-of-control anger I'd felt when my plans of moving were blown up, distant memory, no problems. I was at peace with God's decision, until that is, at about the 2-year mark of being back in New York. I was no longer working at the orchard. I had gotten a really good job working for somebody at my church. I was making really good money, and I was feeling a lot better about my situation of still being in New York. I decided it was time that I needed to move out of my uncle and aunt's house. I'd been with them the entire time I'd been back, but I felt like I needed to live on my own. I was 26 and quickly approaching 27. I was then, and I still am beyond grateful for their sacrifice of letting me get myself squared away in their home. But it was time. It really was. It was time for me to try this adult thing again. Another family in my church, they owned the second house / duplex kind of a thing. It had a third level. I can't even call it a story. It was a third level that they converted into this super crazy tiny little apartment. Oh man, they were willing to rent it to me. I gladly moved in, and I'm telling you, to this day, I have never lived in a smaller place. And it had one window. The entire apartment had one window. It was so tiny, but nevertheless, it didn't matter. I was so happy to be on my own again. I also had a better job. I was still helping coach basketball and soccer at the old school I used to go to. I was still helping with the youth group at church. I felt like, all right, I'm ready. It's time to take the next step. It's time for me to get married. Problem was, there was nobody at church or in my life that I was interested in or were interested in me. I was starting to feel pretty desperate. The same frustrations of not moving a couple years back, they had returned, and I started getting very impatient. See, I still was not dealing with my mental health correctly. So, when I was reintroduced to an old friend that I lost contact with, my brain panicked, short-circuited, and hastily made a terrible, life-altering decision that still affects me to this day, even though it was many, many years ago. But the fallout from this decision, it still hurts. But I will begin telling that story next time. I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to take a quick sip of some water. And I'm going to hammer this home. Can I try to hammer it home in as many of these stories as I possibly can? For those of you who are watching, who struggle, who deal with mental health, and for those of you who are not dealing with it at all, whether correctly or just pretending like it'll go away, I am imploring you. I don't know you, but I'm still imploring you just as passionately. We're going to stop trying to say that word because it's not a word. I'm going to just beg you to please deal with it. Stop pretending like it's going to go away, because it's not. I wasted years of my life pretending that I could handle it, that I could manage it, that I'm not hurting anybody. You may not be married. You may not be living at home with your family, but nobody is an island. Nobody lives unto themselves. At some point through the avenues of life, your life directly touches somebody else's. So if you are struggling with mental health and you're not dealing with it out of pride, embarrassment, whatever, get over it. I lovingly tell you, stop it. Put your big boy pants on and start getting help. I talked about this in a different episode, and truthfully, I don't have stats. I don't know for a fact, but I truly believe that the homeless population, that many of them are due directly to mental health issues, specifically undealt with, or they were dealing with it and then stopped and switched to heroin or whatever. It's something that I have never touched on before in any of my stories. I thought maybe I may, but probably not. It's okay. But God has, throughout much of my life, God has always allowed my path to cross paths with homeless people. I've befriended many homeless people in my life. I've ministered to them, served them, fed them, talked to them about Jesus. And I can tell you right now, every single one of those people that I used to talk to and know, they all had mental health problems. They didn't deal with it. I've heard their stories about their families that they've destroyed because they did not deal with their mental health. And I can tell you right now that many of them who are still alive, they truly wish they could go back and change some of their decisions. Now, this is not a scare tactic. This is not Jeremy Jones telling you, hey, you better deal with your mental health. You're going to end up on the streets. That's not what I'm saying. I am just simply saying that above and beyond everything else, start with Jesus and work your way down. Start dealing with your mental health. Go to my website. There are links there. There are different conversations at this point. Hopefully there's conversations at this point just talking about, those who suffer with their own mental health and tell their own stories, which I encourage you. Tell me your story. I will totally pray for you, and I will listen. I will respond back. But don't do nothing. Don't be idle. Start dealing with us. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. Always thank you for listening. Until I ramble on to you again, keep pressing on.